So, no, I wouldn't say I have a passion for HR.
Welcome back to Human Resources for the People. It's a human capital revolution. Minimum wage is going up in many states, and we got to talk about it. So, for context here, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. It's been that for quite some time. The federal minimum wage started in 1938 with the Fair Labor Standards Act, signed by President FDR. And so at that time, it was 25 cents an hour. It moved up about 11 years later to 75 cents and has gone on. In the 90s, it was 5.15 in 1997, and ultimately landed at 7.25 in 2009, which is where it stands today. And really, what's been happening is that the states have taken over for the federal government. I mean, it's been now 15 years, 14 years since it has been increased, and of course, inflation has laid claim to the wages, and 7.25 is quite low in this day and age, right? But the states have taken the mantle, and ultimately that's where the origins of minimum wage were, right? So, for example, the state of Washington was one of the first to try out minimum wage. Prior to the enactment of the minimum wage or the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, there were instances where state level minimum wage laws were challenged on constitutional grounds, but at the time there was no federal minimum wage. The key constitutional challenge often revolved around the concept of freedom of contract and the limits of government intervention in private economic transactions. One significant case in this context was Atkins versus Children's Hospital in 1923. In this case, the United States Supreme Court struck down a minimum wage law for women in the District of Columbia. The court, in a 5-3 decision, held that the law violated the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment by infringing upon the freedom of contract between employers and employees. The majority opinion argued that the law interfered with the liberty of contract and the rights of individuals to set their own terms of employment. The legal and economic landscape changed during the Great Depression, and widespread economic hardship and labor unrest prompted a shift in public opinion and policy. In response, President FDR signed the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which we use very much today. So let's look at the map. The states have the ability to either have a higher minimum wage than federal or the same minimum wage as federal. And then they can also have lower minimum wages than the federal government, but ultimately the federal government applies. And you can see the general layout of the land. Most of the West Coast has specific minimum wage laws that are in many ways quite high. The West continued to raise minimum wage this year at the beginning of the year with raises in California, Nevada, Oregon, and Arizona. That's a response to pretty significant inflation pressures. The Northeast also pushed quite a few minimum wage increases, all except New Hampshire, which actually is unique in that it doesn't have a minimum wage, a special minimum wage. It just mirrors the federal. This one I like the most because it shows the progression of minimum wage. And so DC is by far and away the highest minimum wage right now, although Hawaii is right behind it. Washington, California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, all states that are incredibly expensive to live in. I think from a business impact and from an overall wage perspective, probably the localized DC makes the most sense, right? So DC has a very specific geographic area with specific costs. And so the idea of having a minimum wage based in that area makes a great deal of sense. Conversely, Washington is wildly different from Seattle to Spokane, and that's where minimum wage can be a little bit more impactful and a little bit potentially disruptive to the economy. Right. There's this world where there's a large difference between the two, and the idea of trying to equalize them could cause some disruptions in the market. That said, in many of these states like Washington and California, they have this, overarching wage, and then specific cities within the state have their own minimum wage. Now, the caution there ultimately is, especially in this remote work environment where people are trying to hire outside of their geographic area, gosh, trying to get yourself into, for example, someone who works in Chicago or someone who works in San Francisco can be quite difficult because you are dealing with all their laws, not just minimum wage, but everything else that goes with minimum wage and operating inside that area. And so that's what I think the caution should be, is trying to manage these laws appropriately such that such that businesses can still navigate, a myriad of state, local, federal, and probably at some point county laws that reflect
What do you think
the
about today's
realities of
video?
the economics
Please
on the ground.
comment
Let
down
me know what
below.
you think about the minimum
Like,
wage in the comments
share,
down
and
below. Like,
subscribe.
share,
It
and
really
subscribe, and we'll
helps
see you on the next
out.
video. Bye,
And I'll
guys.
see you on the next one. Bye, guys.